On the 10th anniversary of the Fukushima disaster, Kevin Kamps reminds us there's no such thing as safe nuclear power. It's an oxymoron. Check it out, leave your comments, ding the bell, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Today, in addition to being the one-year anniversary of the declaration of a pandemic by the World Health Organization, is the 10-year anniversary of the Fukushima meltdown in Japan, which has now affected the entire world. Contaminated water is continuing to go into the Pacific Ocean and bioaccumulating through the food chain into things like giant fish that we eat here even. Or so I am concerned, and so I think. Let's do a reality check on that and what's actually going on with Kevin Kamps, the nuclear waste specialist at beyondnuclear.org. Beyond Nuclear, by the way, is the Twitter handle. Kevin, welcome back to the program. So where are we at 10 years out? Actually, before we even do that, perhaps we should just recap exactly what happened 10 years ago today.
Sure. Well, there was a 9.0 earthquake off the Fukushima coastline that sent a 45-foot-tall tsunami crashing into this 6-reactor complex. And luckily, 3 of the reactors were not operating that day. They were defueled. But the 3 that were operating over the course of the next several days melted down, exploded with massive hydrogen gas explosions, and like you said, released a very large amount of hazardous, deadly radioactivity into the environment, into the air, into the Pacific Ocean, all across Japan. But those radioactive waste streams now in the environment would reach North America within days via the air, and then would rain down with rain and snow. And then in the ocean currents, it took some months, but eventually that plume of radioactivity in the Pacific did reach North America as well. So we've been living with 10 years of this hemorrhaging of hazardous ionizing radioactivity into the environment. The worst of it was at the beginning, but there have been some increases with accidents, with tempests hitting the site in the decade since.
Remarkable. Now, I read in the news, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that Japan is saying that there has been no explosion, probably bad choice of words, but no increase in discernible increase in cancers and thyroid diseases and things like that as the direct result of Fukushima, perhaps outside of a very small area. Am I remembering that right? Am I reading that right? And if so, what's the reality here?
Yeah. Tokyo Electric Power Company, the Japanese government, even the United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation, UNSCEAR. And it's no surprise. We saw similar behavior by the Soviet government, by the United Nations pro-nuclear agencies after Chernobyl began. So it's a constant battle for the truth, as Dr. John Goffman warned after Chernobyl. Concerned citizens, environmental groups have to battle with these official agencies over the truth. And sure enough, there have been clear signs of thyroid pathology in Japanese children that the powers that be try to deny has anything to do with the radioactivity. If they acknowledge them at all, they say, oh, it couldn't be due to this nuclear catastrophe. It must be something else. And we've even seen that kind of behavior by the French government, by the British government, near reprocessing facilities and nuclear power plants, for example. They say, yeah, we're seeing childhood leukemia, but boy, we just can't attribute it to the nuclear activities in the area. How could that possibly be? It's a real whitewashing, to put it politely.
Now, the most widely prescribed drug in the United States right now, or at least this was the case 2-3 years ago when I read a really good research piece on this, was Synthroid, which is a replacement, basically, for a hormone that's produced by the thyroid gland that indicates a failure of the thyroid gland. And it seems like it's most widely consumed by people over 30 or 40, people who would have been alive or nearly alive at the time that the United States was starting their above-ground nuclear testing. Has there ever been a correlation, a proved correlation between thyroid disease in the United States and the above-ground nuclear tests back in the 1950s and early 60s? And is that, and if so, would that correlation be the kind of thing that they're seeing in Japan right now as well?
Yes, there was, after decades of nuclear weapons testing, finally an acknowledgement in the 1990s by the National Cancer Institute of thyroid disease and cancer attributable to nuclear weapons fallout in the United States. And like I said, at Chernobyl, the thing is, in the days and weeks after a nuclear catastrophe like a reactor meltdown, radioactive iodine-131 that is highly volatile and travels throughout the environment and gets into cow's milk, for example, the best thing to do is to avoid contaminated cow's milk. But another thing you can do is take potassium iodide, which will saturate your thyroid gland and not allow the radioactive iodine to enter. But unfortunately, in Belarus, there was no distribution because there was a cover-up. The Soviet government was trying to pretend like nothing had happened. And we saw similar behavior in Japan, incredibly, 10 years ago, a pretense that nothing was wrong when tap water in Tokyo was contaminated with radioactive iodine because the reservoirs were receiving fallout from the nuclear disaster. So that distribution of potassium iodide would make a big difference, and did in a place like Poland, for example, in 1986, where it was distributed. But even here in the United States, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the nuclear power industry for decades has dragged its feet on having pre-deployed potassium iodide. And then, like you said, once the damage is done, all that can be done is therapeutics once your thyroid gland is dysfunctional. So that's when Synthroid will come into the picture. I actually have a personal acquaintance who was born near Hanford Nuclear Reservation in Washington State without a thyroid gland. Incredibly, her thyroid gland was probably nipped in the bud when she was a fetus in her mother's womb. And she's had to live on Synthroid her entire life, which is a huge thing. In Belarus, for example, which is a poor country, it is not easy to get a hold of Synthroid, but there are lots of people who have thyroid pathology because of Chernobyl.
Yeah. Yeah, I know several people who are on this, including my wife, and have been for decades, and we're all suspicious that this just tracks back to those above ground tests, back when we were children. It's amazing stuff. So, Kevin, we've got about a minute and a half till we hit a hard break here. On the 10th anniversary of Fukushima, what are the lessons learned that Americans need to know about, and to what extent are we not learning from that experience here in America?
Well, we've seen what this particular reactor design at Fukushima is capable of. A General Electric Mark I boiling water reactor. Mark IIs are very similar. We have a couple, 3 dozen of those still operating in the United States. They need to be shut down before they melt down. But I would hasten to add that other reactor designs, pressurized water reactors, have their own pathways to meltdown. We saw that at 3 Mile Island. So we really need to abolish nuclear power before it continues to turn time zones into dead zones, like at Fukushima, like at Chernobyl. It's a small planet. A nuclear accident anywhere is a nuclear accident everywhere.
But what about nuclear is so green, it doesn't produce carbon pollution?
Talk to the Navajo Dene and the Pueblo in New Mexico who have lived with the aftermath of uranium mining for more than a half century. It was never cleaned up, with dramatic impacts on the health of their communities.